Chapter 1. The Garden Fate. The sun shone with that deceptive brightness particular to early September, a warmth in the light, but a faint chill at the edges of the air. St. Mary Mead had dressed itself for the annual harvest garden fete, with bunting strung between the limes on the village green and stalls arrayed in cheerful disorder. There were jars of jam with white paper covers tied in string bows, knitted tea cozies in improbable colours, and baskets of late roses cut fresh from the vicar's garden. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a soft dove-grey cardigan and wearing her straw hat with the little forget-me-not ribbon, sat at one of the trestle tables by the cake competition, contentedly sipping her tea. She looked, to any casual eye, merely a sweet old lady enjoying her afternoon, but her pale blue eyes took in the scene with the same gentle sharpness with which she might notice a new crack in her parlour ceiling. Mrs. Willett, newly arrived in the village and eager to be thought sociable, presided over the tea urn. She was a brisk woman with a tendency to lower her voice for effect, which naturally caused half the queue to lean in. Her husband, a retired colonel, hovered by the tombola stall, buying tickets with a kind of cheerful military obstinacy. Near the coconut-shy, young Alice Partridge, all bright frock and restless eyes, was laughing too loudly at something said by Mr. Leonard Prowse, the solicitor's nephew, whose manner suggested he fancied himself quite the wit. It was all rather charming, the sort of scene that seemed to prove the peacefulness of village life. Yet, as Miss Marple well knew, nothing in a village was ever quite as innocent as it appeared. Beneath every polite greeting was a memory, beneath every smile a hint of what it had endured or concealed. The fete reached its gentle peak at 3 o'clock, when the vicar mounted the small platform to announce the raffle winners. A small cheer rose from the crowd when Mrs. Price Ridley won the hand-sewn quilt, though some muttering suggested the prize had been practically made for her by the quilting circle in the first place. Miss Marple's gaze moved idly toward the far corner of the green where a trestle table displayed an assortment of donated books. It was there, quite suddenly, that the ripple began. Mrs. Lenton, a rather fragile-looking woman who helped run the church library, was standing with her hand to her mouth, her eyes fixed on a small leather-bound volume in front of her. Her colour had drained alarmingly, and she dropped into the nearest chair with a whispered, "Oh, dear Lord." Naturally, within a minute the space was crowded. The book table was pushed askew. Someone knocked over a pile of hymnals. Voices rose in that peculiar mixture of concern and curiosity that marks an English village in crisis. And there, in the center of the fuss, lay a Bible, old, well-handled, with gilded edges dulled by years, its pages rifled through until the center section gaped bare. Several leaves were missing entirely, torn out with deliberate force. Before anyone could quite decide what to make of this, the most remarkable thing happened. A man, no one present could later agree on quite where he had come from, staggered into the open space before the bookstall. His face was grey, his lips working soundlessly. In his hand, absurdly, he held one of the torn Bible pages. He swayed, dropped it, and collapsed heavily onto the grass. By the time Dr. Haydock elbowed his way through the gathering crowd, the man was beyond all help. There was, he declared, nothing to be done. The murmurs swelled. Someone fetched a rug to cover him, though not before a dozen curious glances had taken in the strange, lifeless pallor of his skin. Miss Marple, still seated at her table, did not hurry forward. Her knitting bag rested at her feet. Her teacup sat cooling by her hand. She watched the little eddies of conversation forming and breaking, observed who pressed close and who hung back, noted the oddly intent look in young Alice Partridge's eyes as she bent to retrieve the dropped Bible page. It would, she suspected, be quite a long afternoon. And, if she knew anything of such matters, which she did, the Bible with the missing pages would prove far from the least important feature of it. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By the following morning, the small incident at the garden fete had become the only subject worth discussing in St. Mary Mead. It was, of course, rather more than an incident now. A man, a stranger to the village, had collapsed and died in full view of half the parish, and the circumstances surrounding his demise had acquired, in the retelling, a patina of Gothic peculiarity. That it had involved a Bible with several missing pages gave the story just enough strangeness to fix itself firmly in the minds of those who might otherwise have lost interest after tea. At the High Street grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was giving her account to Mrs. Bartlett, the shop assistant, with all the solemn authority of someone who had been near enough to smell the poor man's coat. He was white as the sheet on a mortuary slab, she declared, lowering her voice for emphasis, and clutching that paper as though it were the very thing that had done for him. Mrs. Bartlett, who enjoyed nothing so much as a little healthy speculation before breakfast, asked what was written on it, but Mrs. Price Ridley regretfully admitted she had not been able to read a word before young Alice Partridge whisked it up, like a magpie after a bright button. The butcher's shop offered no less colourful accounts. Mr. Prowse Sr., leaning across the counter, was convinced the dead man had been poisoned. "Saw him on the green," he said. "There was a stiffness to his step. Mind you, it's always the stomach in these cases. I told Leonard as much last night." Nobody questioned the leap from stiffness to stomach, for in village conversations the line between logic and imagination was always pleasingly blurred. Over at the post office, Mrs. Lenton, who had been nearest the Bible at the crucial moment, was telling Miss Hartnell that the missing pages had been from the Book of Ruth, though how she could know that when she hadn't looked closely was left politely unchallenged. Miss Hartnell listened with her usual expression of shrewd disapproval, and then remarked, "Theft of church property is bad enough, but to die clutching the evidence, if you ask me, the two things are bound to be connected." Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her morning stroll to the grocer's with her little net shopping bag, stopping to admire the dahlias outside Mrs. Willett's gate. She neither offered her own theory nor contradicted anyone else's, but she listened, which was her way. In listening, she learned that the dead man had not been recognized by anyone local, that he had been carrying no identification save the torn page, and that Inspector Craddock had been seen conferring with Dr. Haydock outside the vicarage for a good 20 minutes before going into the church hall. She also noted, with that inward filing system she possessed, that Alice Partridge had not been seen all morning, though her aunt claimed she was lying down with a headache. By afternoon, the gossip had taken on a competitive quality, each narrator striving to add a small, intriguing detail. Mrs. Bartlett claimed she had overheard the colonel telling his wife the Bible had been part of a bequest to the church many years ago, left by a certain Mr. Elias Cattermole, a man whose reputation in life had been colourful in ways best not discussed in mixed company. Others said they had heard the dead man spoke just before he collapsed, muttering something about finding her or bind her, the two versions proving equally possible depending on who was recounting the tale. It was at about this point in the day that Miss Marple, while taking her tea at home, received a polite knock on her door. Opening it, she found Inspector Craddock standing there with his hat in his hands. He looked faintly apologetic, as men often did when calling upon Miss Marple in a professional capacity, for it was rather like disturbing a favourite aunt with unpleasant business. "Thought I'd have a word, Miss Marple," he said. "You were there yesterday, I believe?" She invited him in, poured him tea, and let him talk. He described the dead man, early 50s, shabbily dressed but with the bearing of someone once accustomed to better, and the puzzling fact that his pockets had contained neither wallet nor watch. The Bible itself, Craddock explained, had indeed come from the church vestry, though it was not in regular use. The missing pages had been torn out very recently. Miss Marple listened without interruption, only pausing to add more hot water to the pot. When Craddock asked whether she had noticed anything unusual, she merely said, "One always notices something, Inspector, but it is rarely the sort of thing one thinks at first important. And sometimes it is not the person doing something that catches the eye, but the person carefully not doing something." She sipped her tea, looking mildly into the middle distance, and did not elaborate. By the time the inspector took his leave, the village sun was sinking behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the high street. Curtains twitched as he walked back toward the green. In the parlour, Miss Marple sat quietly for a few minutes longer, her hands folded in her lap. In her mind's eye, she saw again the precise way Alice Partridge had bent to pick up that torn page, the momentary pause before she slipped it into her handbag, and the quick glance she had cast over her shoulder. The day's chatter would doubtless grow even more elaborate by tomorrow, but Miss Marple was already certain of one thing. Whatever the missing pages contained, their absence was no idle act of vandalism, and the Bible, in its quiet, battered way, might yet prove to be the most dangerous object in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. By the next morning, the village had settled into that peculiar rhythm which follows an unexpected death. The initial excitement had ebbed, leaving behind a quieter but more persistent undercurrent of curiosity. Faces turned just a fraction too quickly when the door of the post office opened. Voices dropped when someone from the other side of the green entered the grocer's, and small groups formed and dissolved like clouds as news, or something resembling it, drifted from one ear to another. Inspector Craddock had been seen early, striding along the lane toward the vicarage. Word soon followed that he had questioned the Reverend Leonard Clement about the Bible, though no one could say what was discussed. The Reverend, for his part, appeared even more distracted than usual when leading morning prayers, and his wife, Griselda, was overheard telling Mrs. Price Ridley that "these things are always more horrid than they seem at first." That phrase was repeated 3 times before luncheon in 3 separate households, its meaning stretched and coloured according to the teller. Miss Marple took her customary place in the corner of the Blue Boar tea room, ostensibly to enjoy a pot of assam and a slice of seed cake. From there, she could hear Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Hartnell debating whether the dead man might have been a blackmailer. Miss Hartnell was certain that only something deeply personal could have brought a stranger to St. Mary Mead to die so theatrically, while Mrs. Bartlett countered that theatrical deaths were usually reserved for people in novels, not in decent villages. Both agreed that Alice Partridge's sudden illness was suspicious, though they disagreed as to whether it was genuine or conveniently timed. Later, in the lane that wound past the Willets' garden, Miss Marple met Mrs. Lenton, who seemed rather subdued. Mrs. Abat. Lenton admitted she had not slept well, thinking of that poor man's face. She hesitated before adding that she had, at first, believed she recognized him, not from the village, but from some years ago in a neighbouring parish. "Couldn't say for certain, of course," she said quickly, "but there was something about his eyes. Troubled eyes, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and asked no further questions, for she knew that certainty was a plant that grew best when left to find its own roots. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock paid another visit to Miss Marple's cottage. This time he came straight to the point. The torn page, recovered from Alice Partridge's handbag with a mixture of politeness and persistence, contained a short passage from the Book of Ruth, ending abruptly mid-verse. There was nothing on the surface to suggest it was of any significance. The other missing pages had not yet been found. Craddock confessed he was more puzzled than before. "It's like having a puzzle with the middle missing and no picture on the box," he said. Miss Marple, who had spent much of her life quietly fitting together just such puzzles, asked whether the dead man had been identified. "Not yet," Craddock replied. "No papers, no local lodging, no one stepping forward to claim him. We're checking the railway stations. He might have come in yesterday morning, though nobody recalls selling him a ticket." He hesitated, then added, "Dr. Haydock says it's possible he'd been unwell for some time. Heart trouble, perhaps." But that doesn't explain why he had that page in his hand. She made a small, thoughtful sound and poured him tea. The Bible, she said mildly, is a curious object, Inspector. To some it is a comfort, to others a burden, and sometimes, to those with a mind for such things, it can be used as, shall we say, a sort of stage prop? Craddock looked at her sharply, but she only smiled her gentle, non-committal smile. By evening, the investigation had begun to stir the village's quieter corners. The vicarage was said to have received a visit from a lady in a dark green coat who left looking pale and tight-lipped. The Willets had closed their drawing-room curtains earlier than usual, and Mrs. Price Ridley had been seen taking a long detour home from the grocer's, apparently to avoid passing the Partridge house. These small maneuvers, invisible to most, were noted and stored away by Miss Marple, who knew that such changes often signaled the stirring of old sediment in the stream of village life. As darkness fell, she sat by her parlor fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. The rhythm of the work freed her mind to drift back over the day. Mrs. Lenton's uncertain recognition, Alice Partridge's quickness to claim the torn page, the Reverend's distracted air. And over it all lay the image of that battered Bible, lying open on the trestle table with its gap-toothed center. Whatever was missing from its pages was missing for a reason, and that reason, Miss Marple suspected, was not merely theological. In the morning, she decided, she would take a short walk toward the church, not to search for clues. She had no need of muddy footprints or cigarette ends, but to see who might be there, and more importantly, who might prefer not to be seen at all. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The following day dawned grey, with a mist lying low over the hedgerows and curling in the corners of the churchyard. Miss Marple, shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, set out at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the kind that suggested a morning walk taken purely for health and fresh air. In truth, she intended her route to pass the church, the Partridge house, and, if the opportunity arose, the vicarage. It was often remarkable what one could learn simply by being in the right place when others were coming or going. The church itself was quiet, its heavy wooden door standing ajar. Inside, the faint scent of beeswax polish mingled with the cold stone air. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the nave without appearing to linger, yet she noted the absence of the Bible from its usual spot in the vestry cupboard. A slight sound drew her attention, footsteps on the flagstones. Mrs. Lenton emerged from the side aisle carrying a small vase of fading flowers. She started slightly upon seeing Miss Marple, then smiled in a manner that was a little too bright. "Just changing these out," she said. "They'd wilted something dreadful." Her voice was light, but her hands held the vase rather tightly. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the lych gate, ostensibly to admire the yew hedge. From here she could see the Partridge house, its windows shuttered despite the hour. She did not have long to wait before Alice appeared at the garden gate, her eyes darting up and down the lane before she stepped out. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. It could have been anything from a book to a box of tea, but her brisk, almost furtive walk suggested it was not destined for the grocer's. By mid-morning, the hum of village talk had taken on a sharper tone. The first names were being whispered in earnest. Leonard Prowse's was high among them, for he had been seen speaking animatedly to the stranger at the fete, though whether before or after the Bible was discovered varied with the teller. Leonard himself brushed off the suggestion with an airy laugh when Miss Hartnell asked him outright in the post office, but there was a flicker, the smallest of irritation in his eyes. "I speak to all sorts," he said. "Hardly grounds for suspicion, is it?" Then there was Mrs. Willett, whose husband had served abroad with certain regiments known for their close-knit loyalties. Someone, possibly Mrs. Price Ridley, recalled hearing her mention Jerusalem in connection with a family trip many years ago, which in some minds was enough to weave a fanciful thread between her, the Bible, and the dead man. Mrs. Willett denied any such acquaintance, though she looked rather flustered when pressed. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, had begun to take a harder line. 2 villagers were quietly asked to make statements at the station. Leonard Prowse, because of his known conversation with the victim, and Alice Partridge, because of her possession of the torn Bible page. Both interviews were discreet, but in a place like St. Mary Mead, discretion was as thin as tissue paper. By the time the noon bell rang, the entire High Street was aware that certain parties were being looked into. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, allowed her mind to sift through what she had seen and heard. Leonard's careless manner, Alice's quickness to pocket the page, Mrs. Lenton's uncertain recognition, all these were threads, though none yet showed the full pattern. She thought of the man's face as he staggered onto the green, the look of strain mingled with a kind of desperate determination. He had come here for something, and it had been important enough to die with it in his hand. That afternoon, she took tea at the vicarage with Griselda Clement. The vicar's wife was not a woman to traffic in idle speculation, but even she admitted the village felt restless. As they talked, Miss Marple noticed a small stack of church records on the side table, one of which bore a penciled note in the Reverend's hand. E. Cattermole, Bequest, 1904. She filed this away without comment, letting Griselda steer the conversation toward the difficulty of finding reliable help for the harvest supper. As she walked home, the mist had thickened again, giving the village a hushed, almost expectant air. Curtains glowed faintly where lamps had been lit early. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice and was silent. Miss Marple thought of Inspector Craddock's list of those worth questioning and suspected it would not be the last such list he made. For in her experience, the obvious suspect was rarely the true one. But they were always the first to be caught in the net, sometimes because they struggled, and sometimes because they swam toward it of their own accord. She let herself into her cottage, set her knitting neatly in its basket, and sat for a long moment without moving. There was a shape forming in her mind now, faint, incomplete, and she knew it would sharpen only when someone, somewhere, let their guard slip. Until then, the village would talk, the police would prod, and the Bible with its missing pages would continue to cast its quiet, unsettling shadow over St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following morning brought a sharper light to St. Mary Mead, the kind that showed every bead of dew on the grass and made the shop windows glisten. It was the sort of day that suggested freshness and order, yet the village's mood was far from settled. The police inquiries had not ceased, and the sense that something dark and unfinished lay beneath the surface kept people glancing over their shoulders. Miss Marple set out with her shopping basket, moving at her unhurried pace along the lane toward the church. She had heard that the vestry would be open that morning to allow Inspector Craddock another look at the scene, and it seemed a convenient time to happen by. When she reached the porch, she found the door already propped open and Craddock inside, turning over the contents of the cupboard where the Bible had been kept. "Nothing much to see," he remarked, a little tersely, as she greeted him. "The place is tidy enough. No signs of forced entry." Miss Marple glanced at the shelves, taking in the row of hymnals and prayer books. One shelf was slightly dusty, except for a neat rectangle where something had recently been removed. She said nothing about it, only remarking on the faint draught coming from the small leaded window. It was the sort of comment that seemed harmless, yet it allowed her to watch as Craddock glanced automatically toward the sill. There, half hidden behind the curtain, lay a single sheet of thin paper. Craddock reached for it, frowning. It was not part of the missing Bible pages, but a slip of notepaper folded twice. Inside, in a cramped hand, were 2 words. Chapter 15. No book, no name, just that. The inspector tucked it into his pocket with the promise to have it examined. Miss Marple, for her part, looked mildly interested and said she had always thought 15 an oddly unsettling number. Leaving the church, she took the long way home, passing through the lane behind the Partridge house. It was there she noticed something else. The garden gate stood ajar, and just beyond it, on the narrow path, lay a small scrap of leather. Picking it up, she saw it was a binding fragment, the sort used in old books. It was worn smooth at the edges, as though it had been handled many times. She slipped it into her basket without ceremony and continued on her way. That afternoon, the village talk had turned to the curious absence of Leonard Prowse, who had not been seen since the previous evening. Some said he had gone to visit a cousin in Much Benham. Others suspected he was avoiding further police questioning. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that young men with nothing to hide don't simply vanish, a sentiment eagerly repeated by Mrs. Bartlett in the grocer's queue. Miss Marple listened, but her thoughts kept returning to the fragment of leather in the slip of paper. If the binding had come from the missing Bible pages, why was it lying in Alice Partridge's garden path? And if Chapter 15 referred to a specific passage, was it chosen for its meaning, or merely as a marker? She knew enough of human behavior to suspect the former. People who remove things seldom do so at random. They mean something by it, whether they admit it or not. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple called at the vicarage under the pretext of bringing Griselda a jar of damson jam. While the two women sat with their tea, Miss Marple asked, as though idly, whether any parishioner had recently asked to see the older church books. Griselda thought for a moment, then recalled that Mrs. Willett had once expressed interest in those lovely old bindings during a visit to the vestry earlier in the summer. It had seemed harmless enough at the time. As Miss Marple walked home through the fading light, she felt the faint stirrings of a pattern beginning to take shape. A page torn, a note left, a fragment dropped, each one small enough to overlook, but together they spoke of someone moving with deliberate purpose. And though she could not yet see the whole design, she was certain of one thing. The clue had been there in the open, waiting for anyone to see, but no one had looked closely enough. No one, that is, except her. That night she sat by her fire, the scrap of leather on the table beside her knitting. She did not touch it, merely looked at it as though it might, if given enough time, tell her the whole story. Outside, the village was quiet, but Miss Marple knew the stillness would not last. In her experience, a hidden clue was never content to stay hidden. It had a way of drawing the rest of the truth toward it, like iron filings to a magnet. And when that happened, someone, perhaps more than one, would find themselves wishing they had left that Bible well alone. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The following morning began with a brisk wind, sending the last of the early autumn leaves spinning down the high street. There was a feeling in the air, a kind of restless anticipation, that Miss Marple recognized as the moment before a knot begins to loosen. She had woken early, her mind still circling the discoveries of the previous day, the note marked Chapter 15, the scrap of leather, and Mrs. Willett's prior interest in the vestry's old bindings. These were not separate curiosities. They were threads, and threads had a habit of leading to the hand that pulled them. When she ventured out after breakfast, she encountered Alice Partridge just beyond the green. The girl's usual quick smile was absent, replaced by a tautness around the mouth. She carried a small wicker basket, its lid closed tightly, and walked with her eyes fixed ahead. Miss Marple greeted her pleasantly, remarking on the bluster of the wind, but Alice offered only a clipped reply and moved on, as though the simple exchange had been a test she wished to avoid. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the slight hunch of her shoulders, the way her fingers clenched the basket handle. By mid-morning, the village seemed to have divided itself into quiet factions. Those who believed the killer, if killer there was, must be an outsider, and those who insisted the answer lay among familiar faces. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Price Ridley sat with Miss Hartnell, each leaning in toward the other as they discussed Mrs. Willett's rather uncharacteristic absence from the church sewing circle the previous afternoon. Over by the window, Leonard Prowse had reappeared, his expression guarded as he sipped his coffee. He looked up once, briefly, as Mrs. Lenton passed outside but did not rise or call out to her. It was just before luncheon that Inspector Craddock appeared on Miss Marple's doorstep once more. This time, there was a furrow in his brow that suggested some development had unsettled him. "We've had a letter delivered to the station," he said without preamble. "Posted in much Benham. No signature. It simply says, 'Look to the one who carries the word and hides the truth.'" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "If it's meant to be helpful, I can't say it is. Half the village carries a Bible at one time or another." Miss Marple listened, her fingers lightly tracing the handle of her teacup. "Sometimes, Inspector," she said, "those who send such messages mean to stir the pot more than to clear it. A person who wishes to hide will often encourage the looking in the wrong direction." She did not mention that the wording, "carries the word," brought immediately to her mind both Mrs. Lenton's role in the church library and Alice Partridge's possession of the torn page. That afternoon brought the first true confrontation of the affair. Miss Hartnell, never one to shrink from a direct question, stopped Alice Partridge on the lane near the post office and asked, quite plainly, why she had taken the Bible page. A small knot of onlookers pretended to examine the greengrocer's display while listening intently. Alice flushed scarlet, insisting she had only meant to keep it safe until she could hand it to the police. "But the inspector says you never did," Miss Hartnell returned, "and I, for one, would like to know why." Alice's lips pressed into a thin line before she walked away, without another word. The onlookers exchanged glances, their curiosity now sharpened to a point. Later, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Lenton under the guise of returning a book. The small parlor smelled faintly of lavender, and the curtains were drawn against the wind. Mrs. Lenton seemed nervous, her hands fluttering to adjust a cushion that needed no straightening. In conversation, she admitted that she had known of Mr. Elias Cattermole, the man who had bequeathed the Bible to the church. "My father spoke of him," she said. "A complicated man. There were whispers of a scandal, though no one would ever say outright what it was." She hesitated before adding, "Some people said he left instructions, hidden in the Bible. Foolish talk, of course." Miss Marple, smiling gently, did not dismiss it as foolish. Instructions, whether real or imagined, had a way of attracting those who believed they were meant for them. If someone had indeed torn out the pages, it was possible they were searching for something beyond Scripture. As evening fell, the wind rattled the window panes of Miss Marple's cottage. She sat in her armchair, her knitting in her lap, and thought over the day's events. There had been defensiveness from Alice, avoidance from Mrs. Willett, unease from Mrs. Lenton, and a sudden reappearance from Leonard Prowse, who seemed to be watching more than speaking. The circle was tightening, though whether it was around the truth or merely around itself remained to be seen. One thing was certain. The secrets in St. Mary Mead were no longer lying quietly. They were shifting, whispering, brushing up against one another in the dark. And soon, Miss Marple was quite sure of it, one of them would press too far and betray the hand that held it. Chapter 7. Another twist. The next morning brought an odd stillness to the village, as though the wind of the previous day had swept everything into corners where it now waited, hushed and expectant. Miss Marple had risen early, tending to her geraniums before the frost could nip them, and was sitting with her tea when the news reached her by way of Mrs. Bartlett, who came to deliver eggs. "You've heard, I suppose," Mrs. Bartlett said, her voice low and eyes wide. "There's been another, well, they're calling it an incident, over at the church hall." Miss Marple waited, her expression one of polite interest, and allowed Mrs. Bartlett to unfold the story in her own way. It seemed that the church hall had been unlocked early that morning for a flower-arranging committee meeting, only for Mrs. Willett arriving first, to find the vestry cupboard door forced open. The Bible, which had been taken into police custody, was of course no longer there, but someone had ransacked the remaining books and papers, leaving them scattered across the floor. And in the middle of that mess was a single page, one of the missing leaves from the Bible, placed deliberately on the lectern. Inspector Cryptic was already on the scene by the time Miss Marple made her way there. The hall smelled faintly of damp stone and the chrysanthemums that were waiting in buckets for the arrangers. The papers on the floor bore the marks of hurried hands, and the lectern stood like a stage prop under a single shaft of pale sunlight from the high window. On it lay the Bible page, its gilt edging dulled, the printed text neat and unblemished. The verse began partway through a chapter from the book of Ruth, the words speaking of loyalty and return, of binding oneself to another's fate. "What strikes you, Miss Marple?" Cryptic asked quietly, perhaps more out of habit than expectation. She considered the page without moving closer. "It has been placed," she said. "Not dropped, not forgotten, placed where it would be seen. Someone wants us to read it." Cryptic gave a faint sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Or someone wants us to think that." By late morning, the story had spread, growing sharper with each retelling. Some villagers whispered that the verse was a message to a lover. Others insisted it was a warning, though no one could agree to whom. Mrs. Price Ridley, in her best voice of moral certainty, declared that such melodramatics could only be the work of an outsider, and that the village ought to be rid of all this nonsense. Miss Hartnell, however, pointed out that outsiders rarely knew the finer details of vestry cupboards, and besides, the church hall door had been opened with the correct key. Miss Marple spent part of the afternoon in the Blue Boar tea room, her knitting in hand, as Leonard Prowse came in and took a seat near the window. He looked tired, his collar slightly askew, but there was a certain intentness in his gaze as he stirred his tea. When Alice Partridge passed outside, he watched her without lifting his head, his eyes following her until she disappeared down the lane. Miss Marple noted it without altering the rhythm of her needles. Later, as she walked home, she was stopped by Mrs. Lenton, who appeared more agitated than usual. "I shouldn't say anything," she began, then hesitated. "But last night I heard someone outside the church. Footsteps, quite late, and then a sort of creak like a door. I thought perhaps the wind, but now—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking nervously toward the green. Miss Marple reassured her in her calm, unhurried way, promising that the inspector would be told, though she already suspected Cryptic knew more than he was letting on. That evening, the village seemed unusually quiet. Lights glowed behind curtains, and the occasional clink of crockery carried through the still air. Miss Marple sat by her fire, thinking about the deliberate placing of the Bible page and the curious reappearance of Leonard Prowse after his brief absence. In her mind, the act in the church hall was not a random intrusion, but a performance, a way of shifting attention, of drawing eyes away from where they ought to be looking. She recalled something an old gardener in the village once told her. "When the soil's turned over, miss, it's not just weeds that come up. It's stones, too, the kind that have been buried for years." She felt the same was true of St. Mary Mead just now. The Bible's missing pages, the dead stranger, the furtive movements in the night. These were only the weeds. The stones were still buried, but they were beginning to show through the soil. And when they did, she thought, they might prove heavier than anyone expected. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The days had grown noticeably shorter, and the early dusk brought with it a soft hush over St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, seated at her small writing desk, considered the puzzle laid before her like the carefully knitted lace she sometimes made. Complex, delicate, and hiding more than it revealed at first glance. She had followed the threads, listened to the murmurs, and watched the shifting faces of friends and neighbors, but now it was time for a different kind of attention, one less about observation and more about quiet provocation. That afternoon, She set out with a purpose that betrayed none of the weight she carried within. Her first call was on Alice Partridge, whose pale cheeks and restless eyes had haunted Miss Marple's thoughts. Alice opened the door with a hesitant smile, clearly unprepared for company but too polite to refuse. They sat in the sitting room, the afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the faded carpet. Miss Marple spoke gently, asking after Alice's health and how she was managing with the recent events. The girl's answers were guarded, her hands twisting a handkerchief as she spoke. Then, almost as though encouraged by the softness of her visitor's tone, Alice began to speak of the Bible page, how she had found it torn and had taken it to keep it safe. When Miss Marple asked if she remembered anything unusual about the man who had collapsed at the fete, Alice's eyes flickered briefly, and she admitted to having seen him speaking in hushed tones with Leonard Prowse, though she hadn't paid much attention at the time. Next, Miss Marple paid a visit to Leonard himself. Finding him alone in his study, surrounded by legal volumes and scattered papers, he greeted her with a mixture of politeness and mild wariness. She spoke of the importance of small details, of things left unsaid, and the ways people sometimes hide their true feelings behind carefully chosen words. Leonard listened, and in that quiet exchange, a subtle tension shifted in the room, like a thread pulled just tight enough to reveal a hidden knot. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple arranged a meeting at the church hall under the pretense of discussing the upcoming harvest supper arrangements. She invited both Alice and Leonard, as well as Mrs. Willett and Mrs. Lenton, whose names had come up often in her thoughts. The room filled slowly, the air thick with polite restraint and unspoken questions. Seated together, Miss Marple began a gentle questioning, weaving her words carefully to draw out reactions rather than direct answers. She spoke of loyalty and betrayal, of the weight of secrets carried quietly for years, and of the small telling gestures people make when they believe no one is watching. The room grew warmer, the daylight fading, as eyes met and glanced away. Fingers twisted in lap or toyed with teacups. At one point, she spoke of the torn Bible page, reading aloud the passage from the Book of Ruth, her voice calm but steady. The words of binding and loyalty hung in the air like a delicate challenge. She observed closely as Leonard's fingers tightened around his glass, as Alice's eyes grew distant, as Mrs. Willett's face paled slightly, and as Mrs. Lenton shifted uneasily in her seat. Miss Marple's gaze settled briefly on Alice, who met it with a flicker of something unspoken, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. Then she turned to Leonard, whose composure seemed to crack for the barest moment. The gentle probing had begun to unravel the threads the villagers had so carefully woven around themselves. When the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer, her thoughts quietly piecing together the subtleties of each expression and hesitation. She knew the time was near for the final unraveling, for the moment when the carefully concealed truth would slip free like a shadow at dusk. As she walked home beneath the stars, the cool air crisp against her cheeks, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The game was almost at its end. Now all that remained was to watch and wait for the moment when the truth would speak for itself, unbidden and unmistakable. The evening air had taken on a chill as Miss Marple stepped quietly along the village lanes, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The sky was a deepening shade of indigo, flecked with the first stars, and the faint glow of lamplight spilled from cottage windows like scattered fireflies. Despite the peacefulness of the scene, there was a tension threading through the village like a low hum, a current that stirred unseen beneath the surface. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the meeting she had arranged earlier at the church hall, and it had been a delicate dance, her subtle probing designed to unravel carefully held secrets without setting off alarms. Watching the shifts in Alice Partridge's expression had been particularly telling. The moment her calm broke, if only for a breath, told Miss Marple more than a dozen sharp questions ever could. There was something in that flicker of guilt, or was it fear? A small, fleeting shadow she could not ignore. Leonard Prowse, too, had been revealing in his reticence. He was a man trained to control what he showed, yet under the soft light and quiet words, the mask had slipped. His tightening grip on the glass, the slight catch in his breath when the torn Bible page was read aloud. These were the markers of a man wrestling with truths he would rather keep hidden. Miss Marple had seen that tension settle over him like a second skin, something he wore uneasily and which told of deeper troubles than mere legal disputes. Mrs. Willett's admission was another key turning point. The unease in her voice when she spoke of moving the Bible and the weight of the village's judgment told a story beyond the simple facts. She had stepped into a role she was unprepared for, caught between duty and the shadows of gossip. And Mrs. Lenton's recollections of the old scandals surrounding Elias Cattermole added yet another layer, whispers of secrets buried beneath the church's stone walls, stories passed down with caution and a touch of fear. Walking slowly past the hedgerows, Miss Marple considered how the pieces fit together. The Bible was more than an ancient book. It was a vessel of family pride, rivalry, and long-held grudges. The missing pages were not torn out in haste, but removed with deliberate intent, to hide, to protect, or perhaps to destroy evidence of something far more personal than anyone dared say aloud. She thought, too, of Alice and Leonard, their intersecting paths, the moments of overheard conversation, the invisible threads binding them to the stranger whose sudden death had shaken the village. In all her years, Miss Marple knew that such events were rarely isolated. They were symptoms of a deeper illness, rooted in human frailty, pride, and the desperate measures people took to guard their secrets. As the village lights flickered on one by one, Miss Marple's footsteps carried her back toward her own door. She paused, looking up at the stars now shining clearly overhead, and felt a quiet resolve settle within her. The next moves would require patience and care. She would need to watch closely, listen even more carefully, and perhaps wait for the moment when someone let slip the vital piece that could unravel the mystery entirely. Inside her cottage, the fire was low but warm, casting a soft glow over the familiar furnishings. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. The steady rhythm of the craft was a balm for the mind, allowing thoughts to arrange themselves, connections to form in the quiet spaces between stitches. Outside, the village was still, but Miss Marple knew the calm would not last forever. The secrets of St. Mary Mead were stirring, and soon they would no longer be content to remain hidden in shadows and whispers. And when they finally emerged, she would be ready to meet them with the same gentle resolve that had seen her through so many puzzles before. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room as she prepared her thoughts with the quiet composure of one accustomed to unraveling complexities. The village of St. Mary Mead awaited answers, though no one yet dared voice the full weight of suspicion that hung thick in the air. Miss Marple had watched, listened, and gently drawn out the threads, and now, with the final pieces falling into place, it was time for the truth to emerge. Not in a storm, but in the calm, deliberate manner she knew so well. She began her day with a visit to the vicarage, where Reverend Leonard Clement was busy arranging last-minute details for the harvest supper. The Reverend greeted her with his usual mild warmth, but there was a flicker of unease behind his eyes. Over cups of tea, Miss Marple spoke quietly of the Bible, its missing pages, and the strange events that had unsettled the village. Leonard listened carefully, his fingers tapping lightly on the cup's rim. Later, she made her way to the church hall, where a gathering had been arranged under her quiet direction. The key figures, Alice Partridge, Leonard Prowse, Mrs. Willett, and Mrs. Lenton, were present, their faces marked by varying degrees of apprehension. The room held a hush, a shared anticipation that something long hidden would soon come to light. Miss Marple began with gentle recollections, speaking of loyalty and loss, of secrets kept and burdens borne in silence. She recalled the torn pages from the Bible, emphasizing the significance of their removal and the message they might contain. She spoke with such calm authority that the listeners felt drawn into her reflections, unable to look away. Turning her gaze first to Alice, she asked how the girl came to take the page and what she had hoped to protect. Alice faltered, then confessed that she had feared the fragment might contain evidence important to the stranger who died, though she had never imagined it would lead to such upheaval. Her voice softened as she admitted to overhearing a heated exchange between Leonard and the deceased at the fete, though she could not say what had been said. Leonard shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent until Miss Marple addressed him directly. With a slow breath, he revealed the connection that had so far eluded the villagers' notice. The stranger had been a distant relative, Elias Catamole's great-nephew, who had arrived to claim an inheritance tied to the bequest of the Bible. There had been disagreement over the terms, disputes buried beneath layers of family pride and old grievances. The missing pages, Leonard explained, were part of a will concealed within the Bible's bindings, a will that had been contested fiercely by some in the village. Mrs. Willett, who had remained quiet until then, finally spoke. She confessed to having handled the Bible before the stranger's arrival, moved by curiosity and a sense of duty to the church's legacy. In doing so, she had discovered the missing pages and, fearing scandal, had attempted to hide them temporarily. Her actions, she insisted, had been innocent, though she admitted to feeling the weight of the villagers' judgment. Mrs. Lenton added her own piece to the puzzle, recalling the whispered rumors surrounding Elias Catamole and the veiled instructions he had left in the Bible. She spoke of the fractures the bequest had caused among families, and the lengths to which some had gone to suppress inconvenient truths. Miss Marple listened, then carefully outlined how each act, the removal of pages, the handling of the Bible, the secret meetings, had built a web of deception designed to protect reputations and property. She revealed that the stranger's death had been precipitated not by chance, but by the desperate attempt to uncover what had been hidden for so long. The torn Bible pages, the cryptic notes, the disturbed vestry, they were all signs of a struggle not just for inheritance, but for truth. As she spoke, the faces around her shifted from defensiveness to realization. The village's veneer of tranquility cracked, revealing the tangled loyalties beneath. Leonard's eyes met Alice's, and in that glance lay the acknowledgement of secrets shared and burdens borne. Mrs. Willett's posture softened, and Mrs. Lenton's hands rested lightly on her lap, the tension easing at last. When Miss Marple finished, the silence that followed was not one of emptiness, but of understanding. The mystery had unfolded quietly, as she had promised, but its impact would resonate for many days to come. The villagers, once united only by routine, now faced the truth of their intertwined pasts and the fragile nature of trust. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, reflecting on human nature. The capacity for kindness and cruelty, for loyalty and betrayal, often bound together in ways no one wished to see. The Bible, with its missing pages, had indeed been dangerous, not for its scripture, but for the secrets it concealed. Outside, the afternoon sun had softened, casting a warm glow over St. Mary Mead. The village would not forget what had happened, but perhaps it could find a way to heal. Miss Marple rose, folding her hands quietly. Her role was done, for now. She stepped out into the gentle light, ready to watch the slow turning of days as life, inevitably, moved on. The twilight had slipped fully into night by the time Miss Marple closed her door behind her and stood for a moment in the quiet hall of her cottage. The faint rustle of wind outside stirred the lace curtains at the window, and the flickering shadows cast by the firelight danced softly across the worn carpet. It was in these still moments, when the world seemed to pause, that her mind worked most freely, turning over details, reconsidering faces, hearing again the faintest inflections of voices she had caught earlier in the day. The meeting at the church hall lingered in her memory, not so much for the words spoken, but for the silences, the half-smiles, the small, almost imperceptible gestures that betrayed more than any confession. Alice Partridge had been the most revealing, though even her admission was shrouded in hesitation. There was a mixture of fear and loyalty in her eyes that spoke of something deeper than a mere possession of a torn Bible page. It was as if she carried not just a fragment of paper, but a burden of truth too heavy for her young shoulders. Leonard Prowse, too, was a study in contradictions. The careful lawyer, trained to hold his cards close, had shown cracks in his composure when the torn page was read aloud. A brief tightening of his jaw, a glance away, a momentary lapse in his otherwise measured demeanor. These were the small betrayals Miss Marple watched for with an experienced eye. She sensed in Leonard a man caught between duty to his family and a secret he wished to keep buried. Mrs. Willett's confession added another hue to the unfolding picture. Her attempt to shield the village from scandal by temporarily hiding the Bible pages spoke of a woman torn between propriety and curiosity. There was guilt in her voice, too, a recognition that even well-meant actions could deepen mistrust rather than mend it. And Mrs. Lenton, with her knowledge of the old rumors surrounding Elias Catamole, provided the historical backdrop to the present troubles. Whispers of betrayal, lost fortunes, and wills contested in shadowed rooms. As Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire, her knitting resting idle on her lap, she thought about the Bible itself. A vessel of faith, yes, but also a repository of human hopes, fears, and frailties. The missing pages were not merely lost. They had been wrenched away by hands desperate to conceal a truth too dangerous to reveal. The stranger who had collapsed at the fete was more than a victim of ill health. He was a man on a mission, one whose arrival had unsettled old wounds and fragile alliances. She recalled the quiet tension in the room when the torn page was read aloud, the way each person present had reacted in their own way. Alice's eyes darting away, Leonard's fingers gripping the glass, Mrs. Willett's pallor, Mrs. Lenton's tight grip on her handkerchief. Each reaction was a piece of the puzzle, a signpost pointing toward the hidden heart of the mystery. The village itself seemed to hold its breath in those days following the meeting. Normalcy returned on the surface. Children played. Shops opened as usual. The vicar led his services. But beneath the routine, the undercurrent of unease persisted. Conversations were more guarded, glances more searching. The bonds of trust were frayed and old friendships strained under the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple continued her quiet vigil, observing the subtle shifts in behavior. Leonard Prowse grew more withdrawn, his once easy smiles now rare and tinged with fatigue. Alice Partridge avoided the high street during the busiest hours, choosing instead the quieter lanes where fewer eyes might notice her movements. Mrs. Willett busied herself with church matters, perhaps in an effort to distract from the growing whispers, while Mrs. Lenton took to walking alone by the river, her expression distant and thoughtful. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, Miss Marple found herself at the edge of the village green. The air was crisp with the promise of approaching autumn, leaves rustling softly underfoot. She watched as Leonard Prowse emerged from the solicitor's office, pausing briefly to look up at the sky before turning down the lane toward the churchyard. Curious, she followed at a discreet distance. Leonard's steps slowed near the old lich gate, where he paused, looking out over the weathered gravestones and the ancient yew trees. There was a heaviness in his stance, a burden borne in silence. Miss Marple, ever patient, did not approach but allowed him the privacy of the moment, knowing that sometimes the deepest revelations came not from words but from the quiet spaces in between. As twilight deepened, she returned to her cottage, the familiar creak of the floorboards and the warmth of the fire welcoming her home. She reflected on the day's observations, on the delicate threads that bound each villager to the mystery. The torn Bible pages, the secret wills, the family disputes, they were all pieces of a tapestry woven with care and secrecy. That night, sleep came slowly, her thoughts turning over possibilities and motives. She considered the stranger's desperate journey, the clues he carried, and the lengths to which others had gone to protect their interests. The village of St. Mary Mead was a place of quiet charm and deep shadows, where the past and present entwined in a dance as old as time. In the early hours, a soft knock at the door stirred her from restless dreams. Opening it, she found Inspector Craddock, his expression grave but tinged with determination. He stepped inside without ceremony, holding a small parcel wrapped carefully in brown paper. "We found this near the riverbank," he said, placing it on the table. "It was hidden beneath some reeds. Thought you might want to see it first." Miss Marple unwrapped the parcel with deliberate care, revealing an old leather-bound book, its cover worn but sturdy. Inside, several pages were missing, the very ones torn from the Bible. A folded letter slipped out, the handwriting faint but legible. She read quietly. "To those who seek, know that truth binds stronger than blood, and betrayal leaves marks deeper than ink. Find the heart of the matter where shadows gather and light falters." Craddock's eyes met hers. "It seems this is far from over." Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Indeed, Inspector, but every shadow must yield to light, and every knot can be untied. If only we have the patience to wait for the right moment." Outside, dawn was beginning to pale the sky, and with it, the promise of another day filled with questions, discoveries, and the slow unveiling of secrets long kept in the dark. And as the village stirred awake, Miss Marple prepared herself for the next steps of a journey that would test her wits and her resolve like never before. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The days following the revelation passed with a slow, tentative calm settling over St. Mary Mead. The village seemed to breathe again, though an undercurrent of unease remained beneath the surface, like the soft ripple of wind over still water. People resumed their routines. The grocer unpacked his crates, the vicar led prayers, children played on the green, but the memory of the stranger's death and the secrets unearthed lingered in quiet corners and whispered conversations. Miss Marple continued her gentle watch from her cottage window, knitting quietly as the world outside moved through its familiar rhythms. She noticed the subtle shifts, the careful avoidance of certain glances, the new respect tempered by lingering suspicion, the delicate mending of old fractures made visible by the events. Yet despite it all, there was a resilience to the village, a capacity to hold both truth and forgiveness in the same breath. One afternoon, as she walked slowly through the churchyard, Miss Marple paused before the small weathered grave of Elias Cattermole. The stone was worn smooth by time, the inscription barely legible, but it stood as a silent reminder of the past's hold on the present. She laid a single sprig of lavender she had gathered from her garden, and whispered a quiet thought of peace. For the dead, for the living, and for the tangled lives caught between. Returning home, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair by the fire, the soft ticking of the clock marking the steady passage of time. She reflected on the nature of human hearts, how they could be both fragile and formidable, how the smallest actions could ripple outward with unforeseen consequence. The Bible, with its missing pages, had been a vessel not just of faith, but of human frailty and courage alike. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple felt the familiar calm that followed a mystery's close. There were still questions unanswered, shadows that might never fully lift. But for now, the village was safe once more. With a contented sigh, she picked up her knitting, the quiet click of needles a gentle counterpoint to the evening stillness. In St. Mary Mead, life would go on, marked by the echoes of a story that had tested the bonds of community and revealed the hidden depths beneath a peaceful surface. And somewhere within it all, Miss Marple remained. A quiet guardian of truths whispered softly, waiting patiently for the next puzzle to come her way. As the village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its quiet rhythms, Miss Marple sat peacefully by her fire, the soft glow illuminating her thoughtful face. The tangled web of secrets had been gently unraveled, and though some wounds remained tender, truth had found its way into the light. She reflected on the fragile nature of human hearts, how fear and loyalty, love and betrayal often walked hand in hand beneath calm surfaces. Outside, the first stars appeared, twinkling faintly in the cool night sky. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled softly, marking the steady passage of time. Life in the village would continue, shaped now by the events that had tested its bonds and revealed its hidden depths. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, content in the knowledge that justice had quietly settled like a soft blanket over the village. She took up her knitting once more, the familiar click of needles a gentle reminder that, in the end, patience and kindness were the greatest powers of all. And somewhere beyond the glow of her hearth, the Bible with its missing pages rested at last, its story finally told.